Hello, my name is Lindah Kotut from the Information School at the University of Washington. I'll be presenting our paper, Winds of Change, Seeking, Preserving, and Retelling Indigenous Knowledge Through Self-Organized Online Communities. First, I want to define what we mean by Indigenous knowledge. We define this as knowledge, beliefs, and traditions intended to preserve, communicate, and contextualize Indigenous relationship with culture and landscape over time. This knowledge is often passed across generations through oral traditions, storytelling, song, dance, and other performances. We categorize the Indigenous knowledge under the larger research domain of intangible cultural heritage. And in this work, we focus on one Indigenous community called the Kalenjin that inhabit the Rift Valley region of Kenya. The main research question that we sought to answer in this work was, how can we describe and design technology meant to aid amplification, engagement, and preservation of critical oral histories? The solutions to this research question are non-trivial, and because they involve practices, the Indigenous knowledge involve practices that are disappearing with time. We will be contending with questions of appropriateness of technology in this space, and when it is appropriate to include technology, then how do we introduce them in a manner that respects the agency of the story holders? There are other challenges that are inherent with Indigenous knowledge. One is the lack of a territorial narrative. This is where two members of the Indigenous community may have two different versions of the same story. And within the community itself, it's considered a valid thing to have multiple versions of the narrative, but it may not be so when we choose to consider which version of the narrative to preserve. There's also a tendency to place boundaries around what constitutes culture, or focusing on the most visible part of culture, for example, focusing on stories that are connected to artifacts and ignoring those that are not. And third, Indigenous knowledge is constantly evolving as community members reinterpret what it means to them, given the time, their context, and their specific need at any given time. And there are other gaps that we found when we approached this work. And the first is that literature that focus on the Indigenous knowledge or preservation of the Indigenous knowledge, they often report practices that are considered taboo or sacred or secret by the community by often omitting critical contextual detail. The picture that I have on the right side of the screen shows one example of this. This was taken at an exhibit in a museum, and the label reads traditional herbal medicine, and it says traditional herbal medicines has been practiced from time immemorial in Africa. The practice is common in Kenya even today. Many herbal doctors are demanding recognition by the government. Herbalists use part of certain plants to cure human ailments, for example, roots, leaves, branches, and tubers, flowers, and barks. What is missing is which particular community uses this particular traditional medicine, what it is called in the Indigenous language or even in English, and the context by which it was taken so that it can be displayed. All the information that is currently here is just is not useful to identify anything about the community. The other gap is who is tasked in the preservation of that particular Indigenous knowledge, because the lack of without community permission, it can be considered an act of cultural looting. And third is the lack of access to infrastructure. This includes smartphones, because this impacts who can participate from within the Indigenous community. So in our approach, we thought it important to focus on the community itself and what it's doing to balance the evolutionary nature of the Indigenous knowledge while maintaining their agency over their stories when using technology to support, engage, amplify, and preserve the Indigenous knowledge. And we did that by following a twofold study. The first study was a interview-based with 13 Indigenous community members. First, 5 of those members were elders, considered elders or knowledge bearers by the community. They are prominent members of the community and recognized within the community as good storytellers and story keepers. The other members that we interviewed were based on convenient sampling. The second study was online based. We considered community organized Facebook pages and Facebook groups. We started with over 100 pages, and then we narrowed them down, focusing on pages and groups that were open or public. And then we also narrowed it further, focusing on different aspects of culture. I'll first summarize our findings, and then we'll go a little deeper into talking about the different communities. We found in our findings that sentiment varied whether members inhabited the online space, the offline space, or both the online and offline space. There are 3 major findings here. I would direct you to the paper for more. The one significant finding was there's an absence of elders in the online discourse. This was not very surprising because The elders lacked formal language skills, and they also lacked the infrastructure, as mentioned earlier. There's a significant participation of people who are called born towns. They call themselves born towns. These are members who are born and or raised geographically distant from the ancestral homes. This could be just be in the city, or it could be it could range from the city to a different country. There was a lack of language fluency, which the language fluency acted as a gatekeeping measure of discussing Indigenous knowledge, and the lack of language fluency, especially by the born towns, impacts the kind of Indigenous knowledge that they consume in the online space. We then talk about the types of questions and what they sought between those members who are co-located or offline community and those that were distant. In this case, we mean the online communities. When considering those that have access to both online and offline communities, we find that they use the Indigenous knowledge to position themselves in the community through an understanding of the communal structure. So they would ask questions regarding totems, they would ask questions behind names that are given within the communities, and so on. The members that only inhabit the offline space, they would ask the elders themselves questions surrounding their contextual knowledge. So we consider this contextual knowledge as knowledge that is typically learned and shared as part of day-to-day life and community history. And then we have the community members that primarily inhabit the online space. These are the born towns. And most of the questions surrounded the foundational knowledge regarding their indigeneity. This includes their history and vocabulary, especially for those born towns who are maybe second generation members who were not born even in the country, but their parents were members of the Indigenous community, but they themselves were not born or raised within the offline space. We also considered what the motivation of seeking and preserving the Indigenous knowledge, considering where the members were, whether they were offline, online, or in between. And we categorized them into two broad groups. The first groups are the contributors. These are the members who tended to engage with like-minded people interested in cultural aspects of the indigeneity and to contribute knowledge. We have the knowledge seekers, those who look for principles to contextualize their lived experience and add to their understanding of their cultural heritage. And we have community seekers, those who search for ways to connect with the community and find their place within it. These include the born towns. When we consider the motivations of each of these groups, we find that the contributors, they're very secure in their cultural identity, and they manifest this choice and confidence to share in how they share and contextualize the Indigenous knowledge online. These include people who choose to be Facebook page administrators, Facebook group administrators, because they are either secure in their history or they have ready access to their elders to give them context. We have the knowledge seekers who are raised within the community and they're versed in the language and history, but perhaps they've moved away and they're seeking a way to fulfill their sense of community online, or maybe to resolve the cultural crisis of identity. We have the community seekers, those who seek for ways to connect with the communities and find their place within it. This encompasses the born towns, as mentioned earlier. To summarize our work here, we expand HCI perspective of understanding how Indigenous community members engage with Indigenous knowledge on social media. We examine the types of Indigenous knowledge that is sought and engaged with online, contrasted with what the community members interact with offline, focusing on observed difference in roles, for example, of elders. And then we outline design guidelines for researchers and designers towards the respectful use of technology for engaging, preserving, and amplifying Indigenous knowledge, thus guiding the community members in preserving traditions, supporting the evolving culture while respecting the community ownership and agency over their culture. Thank you for your time and attention.